Austria-Hungary was once a powerful state in Central Europe. It was most famously Germany's ally during the First World War, which ended in the nation's total disintegration by the war's end. In fact, the nation was so broken up by the war, Austria and Hungary would sign separate peace treaties with the Allies. However, the fate of the emperor at the end of the war was often glossed over in history books. Whereas the German Kaiser escaped to the Netherlands after the war and hunkered down there for the rest of his life, Austria-Hungary's emperor would not have it so easy. Thank you so much for joining for today's episode, and as I haven't shilled out for cash, there is no sponsor today, but feel free to like and subscribe if you'd like to see more of my history videos in the future. So let's start with some background about the Austro-Hungarian throne. Many of you may be surprised the empire only lasted a short 51 years, and for 49 of those years it was ruled by just one man, Emperor Franz Joseph. Although his reign was stable and unchallenged, his succession was far from. The emperor did have a son, Prince Rudolf, who should have been his successor. Unfortunately, he lived a life of, let's say, many regrets, and tragically took his own life at the age of 30. With the emperor's daughters ineligible for succession, next in line for the throne was his brother's son, Franz Ferdinand. And yes, he was that Franz Ferdinand. Making things worse, he had a rocky relationship with the emperor, and his morganic marriage to a commoner made his own children ineligible for succession. Even Franz Ferdinand needed another relative as a successor. That brings us to the man who would eventually become the last emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph's grandnephew, Charles of Austria. Unlike Franz Ferdinand, Charles of Austria married a noblewoman named Zita of Bourbon-Parma. Thus, any children he had would stand to inherit the Austrian throne. Judging by his wedding photo, you can tell he was terribly disappointed with this arrangement. Franz Joseph was actually quite fond of the young Charles, and in fact you can see him at his wedding in the right-hand corner of this photo. Of course, Charles' uncle Franz Ferdinand would never actually sit on the Austria-Hungarian throne himself. As in one of the most famous events in world history, he was shot and killed to kick off World War I. Although Charles expected to be emperor sometime in his life, he never expected it to come so soon. Then to make matters worse, Austria-Hungary was drawn into a world war. Franz Joseph tried his best to instruct the young Charles, but after 49 years of rule, his time was going to run out eventually. The longtime emperor died in 1916, just 2 years into the war. Charles would go on to be the final monarch to be crowned with the famous Crown of Hungary. In this photo from his coronation, you will see his wife wearing the crown of Austria, and his eldest son, Otto, being crowned prince. Despite the fanfare of his coronation, the country he was about to rule was in really terrible shape. In the Italian and Eastern fronts, the campaign saw no major victories without the significant help of their ally Germany. Even against the tiny nation of Serbia, it took Austria-Hungary over a year to conquer the country. To add to the humiliation, the emperor's eastern army was effectively destroyed by Russia's Brusilov offensive in 1916. At home, it became harder and harder to keep the ethnic groups of the country loyal to the emperor. Emperor Charles made a serious attempt to reform the country as the Kingdom of Austria, Hungary, and Croatia, but this dream would never be realized. In October of 1918, the Parliament of Hungary asked their troops from their half of the empire to lay down their guns and return home. While the Czechs and Croats each declared their own new nation, the Allies agreed to an armistice of what remained of Austria on November 3rd, and Charles' reign was effectively over. Then on November 11th, 1918, he renounced all political responsibilities. Though not technically an abdication, to most historians, this was the end of his story. But of course, his life went on. Despite high hopes of returning after the dust had settled on the ashes of his empire, he had to leave for now. The United Kingdom was kind enough to help him escape to Switzerland, where he planned to wait things out. Unfortunately for him and his family, the new Republic of Austria quickly abolished the monarchy. Him and his family were banished from ever returning. He wasn't even allowed to be buried next to his predecessor, Franz Joseph. However, this would not be the end of his imperial ambitions. He had been the ruler of Austria-Hungary, and returning to rule Hungary would remain up in the air. As luck would have it, Hungary chose to return to a monarchy, and many powerful individuals sought his return. Charles even made 2 entire attempts to enter Hungary once again, but twice he was denied by his regent Miklos Horthy. Unfortunately, Horthy used the regency to become a thinly veiled dictator, and Charles would have meant the end of his rule. Although Hungary remained a kingdom until the end of World War II actually, it had already seen its last king. Upon Charles' second attempt to retake his throne, he was arrested and turned over to the Allies. Still seen as a threat to a very fragile and fractured Eastern Europe, the Allies felt there was no other choice. This time, his family boarded a ship to a destination unknown. Charles would have to live out his last days in exile in a place of British choosing. However, unlike the Emperor Napoleon, he was at least to die in a pleasant place. That, of course, was the remote Portuguese island of Madeira. However, I was lucky enough to visit Emperor Charles's tomb on the island of Madeira, so let's take a look. Right now, we're at the final resting place of the last Emperor of Austria-Hungary. He is currently buried here in the Church of Our Lady that is right in front of me. He would pass away here on the island at the young age of 34, of nothing more than just a cold. By that point, he'd sold nearly everything he had, and survived 2 heart attacks. Then, considering his failure to reclaim the throne, the stress had surely hastened his premature death. Then his 7 children and pregnant wife would spend the rest of their lives in poverty. However, having been beatified by the Catholic Church, his final resting place is well looked after here. The only thing that is missing is his wife Zita, who was never laid to rest next to him. As for the rest of his family, they had no choice but to go on without him on very little income. Zita and her children had to move many times based on the few financial options they had. Their situation was so dire that at one point she had to feed her children flowers just to survive. She would go on to devote much of her time to the church in her later years and was named Servant of God by Pope Benedict after her death. That being said, it was coincidental that her name was the patron saint of servants. The Empress would live 65 years after her husband's passing and never remarried. Despite all the struggles, her children all survived into adulthood, and many of whom survived well into the 20th century. In fact, Prince Otto, the little crowned prince you see in this photo, he would pass away in 2011 at the age of 98, 95 years after taking the title of Crown Prince, and 89 years after the Emperor himself had passed away. So despite the Emperor's premature death, he would certainly be happy to know that his family lived the long and full life that he didn't. So in summary, Charles of Austria, the last Emperor of Austria-Hungary, fled into exile on his own terms at the end of World War I. Unlike German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm, though, he made a serious and realistic attempt to reclaim one of his titles. After the attempt failed, he was taken into exile by the British to the island of Madeira and died of natural causes. In spite of all this, his family was able to live mostly normal lives without him. Personally, I think the reason why Emperor Charles is part of forgotten history is that unlike Kaiser Wilhelm or maybe the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, it's pretty hard to demonize a family man. You can't deny that he really did care for his family, and he really wasn't a bad guy at the end of the day. After all, he wasn't even in power when the war started, but I really feel like he's just kind of passed over just because it just doesn't fit a narrative of the Central Powers being the quote-unquote bad guys in the modern perspective. So personally, I really think Emperor Charles was a very nice guy, and as you can see, I visited his tomb, and I have to say it was quite an experience. Hopefully I'll get to visit Queen Zita also someday, but personally, I kind of like the guy, and I would be more than happy to do a more in-depth video of him in the future.